Hi guys, it's Dr. Bloom, and I wanted to continue the conversation I started when I was in the National Wildlife Refuge the other day. Um, so I wanted to talk about how the U.S. became the world's biggest provider of outdoor rec opportunities. And I'm going to start here. This is a picture that I took at Grand Canyon National Park, which, if you ever get to go, it's truly amazing. 77 miles of canyon, which is huge, and it's a mile deep. So, and in some places it's straight down. So it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to go see it. So if you ever get there, um, I suggest you enjoy it. Um, so I'm going to start here with the pause that our national and state parks, when they were created, since they were created, it has been known as America's best idea, because it is something that we exported to all the other countries. Before the national parks, America wasn't a big exporter of anything. I mean, think about it. National parks came in the 1800s. Cars didn't come until the early 1900s and beyond. So, this stuff we produce in factories has really been since the 1940s. So this was our best idea, and this created national park systems throughout the world. So, but when we look at parks, we're looking at a much bigger history and much longer history. So originally, it came from settlers that had moved over from Europe, and they were envious of Europe's garden. So they wanted to set up some idea of parks. So they set up ones like Boston Commons and Salem Commons in more of the European styles. And those commons were used as government centers. They were gathering points. They were places where people visited over time, in order to, like, if government needed to make a point of somebody's mistakes, they would do a hanging or a trial on the commons. They would also announce all the policies and everything else. So it was really a way of blending their past from Europe into the New World. And so, that's sort of where we started. So when settlers came over, they cleared land at a fast rate. I mean, we were forest to forest, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so the very first thing was that they were clearing land. They didn't work the land. So most forests were used for shipbuilding. So if you start with settlers coming into this country, within 10 years, the wood source was 10 miles away. So from 1630 to 1640 in Boston, it moved from being right up to the coast to being back 10 miles. By 1745, it was 100 miles away. So that was quite a distance in a time where the only travel was by horse. By 1715, Boston supplied the lumber for 50% of England's ships. And when you look at our revolution, that came in the late 1700s. So we were helping England be a naval powerhouse then. And so, as I was saying, settlers first created the parks, and they created them as commons. So they were governmental lands, but they were also used for timber, livestock, grazing, as well as the political and social reasons. In 1710, Newington, New Hampshire set aside the first community forest in the U.S. And as I've been saying, everything was European in that style at that point. But so late 1700s, we go through the Revolution, and then we create our own country, right? So when we're creating our own country, you have to create a government from scratch, and you have to build that country. So we had a period in the early to mid 1800s called the Westward Expansion. And during that time, we were purchasing lands. Like there was the Louisiana Purchase, and I'm from Michigan. Michigan was brought into the fold around 1836. So there were different treaties and deals made with foreign governments that allowed us to purchase parts of the U.S. And so as we were able to expand westward, the government offered people deals to move out west. And within those deals, they also sent artists and writers in order to paint and take photographs of what the West looked like. So these artists and writers were able to produce what was called a romantic attitude towards nature. So nature was wild, but it was beautiful. And Americans wanted to have something that was theirs and that was important. And so at that point, they really chose to value nature. Nature is our thing. It is what we have that is more unique than anywhere in Europe. We can tame it, but it's ours. And it's beautiful. So after the period of Romanticism, we had Transcendentalism. And most of you guys have heard of Walden or Henry David Thoreau. Again, famous author. Transcendentalists saw Americans losing touch with nature. We had a lot of urbanization going on in the mid-1800s after the Civil War. And because we saw all this destruction, there was a thought that nature is essential. So Thoreau in 1845 went to Walden Pond to escape civilization, and that's a picture of his little cabin. Walden Pond is now managed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation as a state park. And so Thoreau quoted or developed the idea that in wildness is the preservation of the world. So it was really part of an intellectual revolution that nature is attractive and important to us spiritually and emotionally. So that area of wellness that we've talked about has really rang true all along, that nature is an important part of the human spirit. So some important transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote Nature from Boston, Henry David Thoreau. I could show you a video, but I'm not going to at this point. John James Audubon was a painter of birds, and so that's where the Audubon Society's name came from. And then you had landscape painters like Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, which if you're ever in Salem and you go to the Peabody Essex Museum, there are a number of paintings by Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, and they are stunning. So you had all this going on, right? And as nature becomes our thing, we start to actually care about it and protect it for various reasons. So in 1832, Arkansas Hot Springs became a national reserve, and it was named a nationally important land. It was really our first designated land like that, because the hot springs brought minerals and they were good for the human body, and so it became a place that we wanted to keep. It eventually became Hot Springs National Park. So it's been the first dedicated national land, but it's not our first national park. 1839, Chicago designated an outdoor rec site near Fort Dearborn. So that was the first outdoor rec area. And in 1844, New York formed the first association for the protection of game. So hunting and fishing became a thing. 1850, Central Park was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who also formed the Emerald Necklace around Boston. Calvert Vaux worked with him on this. And the purpose of Central Park was escape, exercise, and relaxation. And when you look at it, it really is a green oasis in a whole bunch of concrete. So the concrete jungle of New York meets the escape of Central Park. So then, we go further along. We still have, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we still had westward expansion. We had a bit of the Industrial Revolution. So we were starting to make cars. We were starting to produce things. You had the invention of the automobile and transportation systems. We had trains, so people could travel on something besides a horse at that point. And so, like, tourism really started in the late 1800s in America, as did, westward expansion continued. So we had all of those things. In the 1860s, going back to our national park lands, Frederick Law Olmsted argued for the development of Yosemite Park. He had been to California and thought it was magnificent. And in 1864, Yosemite was granted to California as a state park. So that was the first major move to preserve land, big chunks of public land. And then in 1872, we had Yellowstone was named our first national park. So, sorry, these are not real great, but I'll put up the slides for you too. 1870s to 1900s, national park status was granted to Yosemite, Sequoia, General Grant Grove, and Mount Rainier, all in the west. The Adirondack Mountains were named DeForest Wilderness Area, and then later renamed Adirondack State Park with 3 million acres, which is a huge chunk of land. At the same point, Niagara Falls was then set aside as a public reservation. So these were our oldest public lands. As I said, Yellowstone was created as our first national park in 1872. And its mission was a public park or a pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So recreation, really. The main mission of the National Park Service is recreation and conservation. So the battle started as soon as we set aside these lands. At that point, there was 1 million acres of public land set aside, and we used the U.S. Cavalry as managers. So the Army horse-mounted rangers were sort of the ones who kept track of the national parks and kept them safe from people squatting and taking over lands within the parks. So there's a list of some other national park lands named. The picture's Fort Mackinac in 1875. Spelled Mackinac, but it's Mackinac because it's in Michigan. So I know the names. And so that was named a national park, but it's now a state park. So there you go. 1890, you had the formation of Yellowstone or Yosemite National Park. So now we had Yellowstone and Yosemite, and then a bunch of the other places that I've shown you previously. So we had a national park system then. At the same point in 1891, we had Yellowstone Timberland Reserve was the first national forest that was set aside. And so we had the development of that system. And in 1905, the U.S. Forest Service was found, and they managed timber and grassland and provide recreation. So some other dates that are important. 1906, we had the Antiquities Act, which is the presidential ability to designate national monuments. Theodore Roosevelt was president at that time and named 18 national monuments. Now, national monuments are ruled by the National Park Service. And the difference between a national park and a national monument is a national park has to be voted on by Congress. A national monument can be named by the president. So it's sort of easier to get that status. It means it's no less in terms of management or anything, but the status of a national park is greater than the status of a national monument. 1916, Woodrow Wilson signed the Organic Act, which created the National Park Service. So that was to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and provide for enjoyment that will leave it unimpaired for the future generations. So there's always this conflict within the National Park Service, recreation and conservation. So setting aside stuff to protect it, to leave them unimpaired, which means in great condition, but yet provide recreation. So NPS always has a balancing act. First director was Stephen T. Mather. In 1916, the park system had 37 areas, then grew slowly, and there were political struggles. And then in 1933, 63 national monuments and military sites were transferred to the National Park Service from the Forest Service and the War Department, so the Department of Defense. And so that created our national historic sites and national military parks, starting from then on. So, additionally, when you talk state parks, 1920s, you had your first meetings in regards to developing state park systems. And then in the 1930s, states started creating state park systems. And following state parks, there were then local park systems developed. So the development of our parks at all levels, whether they're your neighborhood parks or they're the big national parks, it all started following the first national park in 1872. So we're going to get into some specifics. So our public lands now make up a third of the U.S. We direct the agencies that I discussed in the first little lecture directly manage approximately 700 million acres, but they have something to do with like 1.5 billion acres overall. So that is a lot of land. They include national parks, national forests, recreation areas, historic areas, greenlands, greenways, riverways, and those things. And each of these lands is managed for different purposes by different agencies. So, as mentioned, these are some of our public land managers: National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and U.S. Forest Service. So the first three, as I mentioned, are managed within the Department of the Interior. The second one is the Forest Service is managed by the Department of Agriculture. And then you have the Tennessee Valley Authority and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as secondary public land managers. So National Park Service created in 1916. I've been over a lot of this, but they manage about 85 million areas. I'm going to skip that. Today, there's 423 areas that they manage. They're in 50 states and a bunch of our territories. National parks account for over 327 million recreational visits a year, over 1 billion recreation visit hours, and over 13 million overnight stays. So that's camping or cabins or lodges. There's another 150 related areas. There's 62 national parks, and then 19 other designations. The different designations are like national parks, national preserves, national historic sites, national battlefields, national seashores or lake shores, and national monuments. Bureau of Land Management, our newest land management agency, it was created in 1976, and its mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. So they manage 258 surface acres and 700 million subsurface acres, meaning minerals, in the western U.S. They've got different use designations, as you can see. Originally, the BLM worked under a mixed group of early laws. So Mining Law of 1872, Grazing Act, Desert Land Act, so on. But then in 1976, an all-encompassing act, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, was passed, and it really defined what the purpose and authority of the Bureau of Land Management is. So they're under what's called a multiple use mandate, meaning that they manage for 5 different things. They manage for timber, so they manage forests for trees that are produced and cut down. They manage grazing, so they have a lot of cattle leases. They're managed for minerals, so there's oil and gas leases, as well as different mineral leases within the public lands. There's recreation. Their recreation's different from National Park Service recreation. National Park Service recreation's all non-motorized. BLM allows some motorized recreation on their lands, so I'm talking ATVs and four-wheelers and that sort of thing too. And they also have to manage for water quality. So 5 main things, there you go. Fish and Wildlife Service was originally created in 1939. Their mission is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish and wildlife and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. They manage 77 million acres, and they have a number of use areas that they're supposed to manage. But the big 2 are national wildlife refuges and national fish hatcheries. They also managed a total of 943 sites, or 855 million acres when you account for other lands that they oversee. So they oversee a lot. The history, originally it was created as a commission on fish and fisheries. And so it was based around the decline in food fish. We were overfishing, so they wanted to know why and how we can manage that. And then there was a division of ornithology and mammalogy, so birds and mammals, was established in the Department of Agriculture. And then we had the passage of the Lacey Act, which was the first federal law that protected game or wildlife and prohibited the interstate shipment of illegally taken wildlife or the importation of species from outside. So, very important act, the Lacey Act. So today, the Fish and Wildlife Service manages 567 refuges in 50 states and territories, so over 146 million acres. They totally manage 943 sites in 855 million acres. So that's half of that 1.5 billion total acreage that we discussed. Almost 60 million visits a year. And they manage our Endangered Species Act as well as numerous others, and they provide nature-based recreation. So all non-motorized, no dogs. It's all about the wildlife first. And then we have the USDA Forest Service. It's called USDA because it's Department of Agriculture. So they want to separate it from the interior bureaus. Created in 1905 to sustain the health, productivity, and diversity of the nation's forests and grasslands, to meet the needs of present and future generations. It managed 200 million acres, and most of them are national forests and grasslands. So the original mission: provide the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people in the long run. Gifford Pinchot, who was a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, was named first chief, and they were originally designed for providing quality water and timber throughout the country. But they got so good at that they wiped out all the forests by the mid-30s. So then they had to change their management strategy to one of multiple use and sustained yield, meaning that they slowed down on how much they were harvesting and looked at water, forage, wildlife, wood, and recreation as being part of their mission. So they had to change quite a bit. Today they manage 200 million acres in most states. It's 155 national forests, 22 national grasslands. They also have wilderness areas, national rec areas, national scenic areas, etc. 149 recreational visits a year and 14 million overnight stays. And then we get to state parks. So every state has a system of state parks and conservation lands. And every state is slightly different. For example, in Tennessee State Park's mission is to preserve and protect in perpetuity unique examples of Tennessee's flora and fauna while providing recreation. So it's similar to the National Park Service. South Carolina state parks are set up under the Department of Tourism, so their mission is based around providing for tourism and recreation first. So everything's a little bit different by state. State park facts. I mean, this is old, but it's not all that much different. There's over 5,000. I gotta find where we were. Okay, over 5,808 areas, 200,000 campsites. There's a whole lot of different use areas, as you can see. And the number of visitors is slightly bigger than those two are national parks, but it's, state parks are a little more accessible to people and a little bit cheaper. So you have that. So that's what I have for this. You have a number of assignments that highlight our state or our outdoor rec and how things are managed and what some of the issues are. So you'll have a number of assignments about that today, and then tomorrow you'll go into environmental policy, and we're going to do a special assignment on my friend the beavers, just because it's kind of fun to look at them. They're very interesting animals, so we'll look at that. We'll look at some other stuff, but there you have it. So have a good day. Good luck.